She didn't ask for rescue, didn't even look back when she slipped through the shelter's back door at midnight, carrying nothing but a worn duffel bag and bruises that told a story no one should ever have to live. But he saw her stumbling down the empty highway, a single dad driving home from a late shift, a woman in military fatigues with nowhere left to run. He was a mechanic raising his teenage daughter alone. She was a soldier fleeing the very place meant to protect her. Neither of them knew that one moment of compassion would set off a chain of events that would bring her commanding officer to their door, carrying news that would shatter everything. They thought they knew about her past and change both their futures forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra. Special for you, the headlights of Julian Underwood's pickup truck cut through the November darkness like tired eyes trying to stay awake. It was past midnight on Highway 47, the kind of desolate stretch that connected the industrial district of Ironwood Springs to the residential neighborhoods where normal people slept in warm beds. Julian wasn't normal people, not anymore. Normal people didn't work double shifts at Patterson's heavy equipment just to keep the lights on and put food on the table for a 15-year-old daughter who deserved so much better than what life had handed them. The radio crackled with late night talk shows and static as Julian rubbed his eyes, feeling every one of his 34 years settle into his bones like lead. His hands, permanently stained with motor oil and rough from years of wrestling with broken machinery, gripped the steering wheel as he counted the miles home. 7 more to Birchwood Lane, where his daughter Sophia would be fast asleep, probably, with her homework half finished on the kitchen table and the TV still flickering in the living room, because she'd fallen asleep waiting for him again. That's when he saw her dot at first. It was just a shadow moving along the shoulder of the road, a dark figure that shouldn't have been there, shouldn't have been anywhere at this hour, in this cold, on this forgotten stretch of asphalt that even the streetlights had given up on. Julian's foot moved instinctively toward the brake as his headlights swept over the scene, illuminating what no father, no decent human being, should ever have to witness. A woman in military fatigues, walking with the uneven gait of someone who was hurt, someone who was running from something terrible. Her dark hair hung loose around her face, and even from a distance, Julian could see the way she held herself protective, guarded, like someone who had learned the hard way that the world was full of people who took more than they gave. A canvas duffel bag hung from her shoulder, everything she owned reduced to what she could carry in one hand while the other clutched her side. Julian's truck slowed to a crawl, then stopped completely about 20 feet ahead of her. Through his rearview mirror, he watched as she froze, every muscle in her body going tense like a deer caught in headlights. But this wasn't a deer, this was a soldier. And soldiers didn't freeze unless they had learned to be afraid of the people who were supposed to help them. He put the truck in park and sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel, trying to figure out what to do. In Thornfield County, you didn't see many soldiers, and you definitely didn't see them walking alone on dark highways at midnight, looking like they'd been through hell and weren't sure if they'd made it out the other side. Julian had been raised by a mother who would have skinned him alive if he'd driven past someone in need. But he'd also been raising a teenage daughter in a world that had taught him to be careful, to think twice, to not get involved in situations that might bring trouble to his door. But as he watched her in his mirror, saw the way she kept looking over her shoulder like she expected to see demons chasing her, Julian made a choice that would change everything. He turned off the engine, grabbed his jacket from the passenger seat, and stepped out into the cold night air. The woman had started walking again, faster now, her boots making soft sounds against the gravel shoulder. She was trying to put distance between herself and his truck, trying to disappear into the darkness like she'd never been there at all. "Ma'am," Julian called out, his voice carrying across the empty space between them. "You okay out here?" She stopped walking but didn't turn around. Julian could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hand moved slightly toward her pocket like she was reaching for something that might keep her safe. In the pale moonlight, he caught a glimpse of her profile, young, maybe late 20s, with the kind of sharp alertness that came from military training and the hollow exhaustion that came from something much worse. "I'm fine," she called back, her voice steady despite everything. Military voice, Julian thought. The kind of voice that had been trained to never show weakness, never admit to needing help, never let the enemy see you bleed. "Nearest town's 7 miles, Julian said, taking a few steps closer but keeping his distance, keeping his hands visible, trying to be as non-threatening as a 6-foot mechanic with oil under his fingernails could be. "It's cold, and there's nothing but farmland between here and there." "I can walk," she replied, and Julian believed her. This was a woman who had probably walked through places that would break most people, who had survived things that would send normal civilians running for the safety of their suburban homes. But surviving and living were two different things, and Julian could see the difference written in every line of her posture. "I'm sure you can," Julian said, stopping about 10 feet away from her, "but you don't have to. I've got a daughter at home, and she'd never forgive me if I left someone out here in the cold. No strings, no questions. Just a ride to town, or wherever you need to go." Finally, she turned around. In the dim light from his headlights, Julian got his first real look at her face, and felt his heart clench with a mixture of anger and compassion that threatened to overwhelm him. This was someone's daughter, someone's soldier, and someone had hurt her. The evidence was there in the careful way she moved, in the defensive set of her shoulders, in eyes that had seen too much and trusted too little. "Why?" she asked, and the single word carried the weight of 1,000 disappointments. 1,000 times someone had offered help and then demanded payment in ways that had nothing to do with kindness. That Julian thought about Sophia, asleep in her bed, trusting him to come home safe every night. He thought about his ex-wife, who had left them both when the going got tough. He thought about all the times he'd needed help and been too proud to ask for it, too afraid of being seen as weak or broken or unable to handle what life had thrown at him. "Because," he said finally, "sometimes we all need someone to stop." For 30 seconds that felt like 30 years, Maeve Wood stood in the November cold, studying the face of the man who had stopped for her. In her 8 years of military service, she'd gotten good at reading people, reading their intentions in the set of their jaw, their honesty in the way they held their hands, their capacity for violence in the distance they kept or closed. This man, this stranger with motor oil under his fingernails and exhaustion written in the lines around his eyes, wasn't like the others she'd learned to fear. Julian Underwood waited, patient as winter, while she made her choice. He didn't push, didn't take a step closer, didn't let impatience creep into his voice or his posture. He just stood there, hands visible, truck running warm behind him, offering the kind of help that didn't come with conditions or expectations. It was the first time in 6 months that someone had offered her something without wanting something else in return. "Just to town," Maeve said finally, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the truck's engine. "I can find my way from there." Julian nodded, walking back toward the driver's side without making her feel cornered or trapped. "No problem. Hop in whenever you're ready." Maeve approached the passenger door like she was approaching a potential. Eyed careful, alert, ready to bolt if anything felt wrong. But when she opened the door, all she found was a worn bench seat with a coffee-stained thermos in the cup holder and a paperback novel tucked into the door pocket. The cab smelled like honest work and pine air freshener. Nothing threatening, nothing that set off the alarm bells that had been ringing in her head for months. She climbed in, keeping her duffel bag clutched tight against her chest, and Julian pulled back onto the empty highway without comment. The radio played soft country music that filled the silence without demanding conversation, and for the first few miles, neither of them spoke. Maeve stared out the passenger window at the dark farmland rolling past, while Julian focused on the road ahead, giving her the space to breathe, to assess, to decide how much of herself she was willing to reveal to this stranger who had materialized out of the darkness like an answer to a prayer she'd been too afraid to say out loud. "I'm Julian," he said finally, his voice quiet and careful. "Julian Underwood. I work at Patterson's Heavy Equipment, about 15 minutes from here." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Maeve," she replied, then added after a pause, "Maeve Wood, thank you for stopping." "Anyone would have stopped," Julian said, though they both knew that wasn't true. Plenty of people would have driven right past, would have told themselves it wasn't their problem, would have found a dozen reasons why getting involved was too risky, too complicated, too much trouble for a Tuesday night. Maeve shifted in her seat, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at whatever injury she was carrying beneath her fatigue jacket. Julian caught the gesture in his peripheral vision, but didn't comment, didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. Instead, he reached over and turned up the heat, the small kindness speaking louder than words. "You military?" Julian asked, nodding toward her uniform. "Army," Maeve confirmed. "Logistics specialist. Just got back from my second deployment about 4 months ago." She didn't mention that she'd been at Fort Brennan since then. Didn't mention the transitional housing program that was supposed to help veterans get back on their feet. Didn't mention the counselor who had turned out to be more interested in what he could take from vulnerable women than what he could give them. "Thank you for your service," Julian said, and he meant it. Not the automatic, empty gratitude that most civilians offered, but the real thing, recognition from someone who understood what it meant to carry responsibility for others, to sacrifice your own comfort for something bigger than yourself. They drove through the outskirts of Ironwood Springs, past the closed gas stations and darkened strip malls, past the kind of small-town infrastructure that had seen better days but kept grinding forward anyway. Julian found himself stealing glances at his passenger, noting the way she sat perfectly straight, despite her obvious exhaustion, the way her eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, the way she held herself like someone who had learned that relaxation was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Where you headed?" Julian asked as they approached the town center, such as it was a couple of traffic lights, a 24-hour diner that served as the unofficial gathering place for night shift workers and insomniacs, and a bus station that connected Ironwood Springs to bigger cities with better opportunities. Maeve was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the empty streets, like she was trying to figure out the answer to that question herself. "I'm not sure," she admitted finally. "I was staying at a facility outside town, but ... She trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging in the air between them like smoke. Julian felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd heard stories, whispered conversations between mechanics and factory workers who'd served their time overseas, about the places that were supposed to help veterans transition back to civilian life, but sometimes became something else entirely. Places where the vulnerable got more vulnerable, where the people in charge took advantage of those who had already given everything for their country. "The Grandview Manor facility?" Julian asked quietly, remembering the news stories from a few months back, the investigations that had been quietly buried, the officials who had been transferred rather than prosecuted. Maeve's entire body went rigid, confirming his suspicions without her having to say a word. Julian felt a surge of protective anger that surprised him with its intensity. He barely knew this woman, but the thought of anyone taking advantage of someone who had served, someone who had put her life on the line for people like him and his daughter, made his hands tighten on the steering wheel. "You can't go back there," Julian said, the words coming out before he'd fully thought them through. "I don't have anywhere else to go," Maeve replied, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of desperation that she was trying hard to hide. "My savings are gone, my family ... She stopped, shaking her head. It's complicated. Julian pulled into the parking lot of the all-night diner and put the truck in park, but he didn't turn off the engine. Through the windows they could see a handful of night workers hunched over coffee and pie, creating small islands of warmth in the fluorescent-lit space. It was the kind of place where you could sit for hours without anyone bothering you, where the waitresses understood that sometimes people needed more than food. They needed a place to exist without judgment. "Look," Julian said, turning to face Maeve for the first time since she'd gotten in the truck. "I know we just met, and I know you don't have any reason to trust me. But I've got a couch, and my daughter would never forgive me if I dropped you off at a bus station in the middle of the night with nowhere to go. It's not charity," he added quickly, seeing the pride flash in her eyes. "It's just what neighbors do." Maeve studied his face in the light from the diner's neon sign, searching for the catch, the hidden agenda, the trap that her experience had taught her to expect. But all she saw was a tired man who worked with his hands and worried about his daughter. A man who had stopped because stopping was the right thing to do, not because he wanted something in return. "Just for tonight," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian nodded, putting the truck back in drive. "Just for tonight," he agreed, though something in his chest told him that this moment, this choice, was going to change everything for both of them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Julian's house sat at the end of Birchwood Lane like a promise that had been kept, despite everything life had thrown at it. It wasn't much, a modest two-story, colonial with white siding that could use a fresh coat of paint and a front porch that sagged slightly on one side, but it was clean, well-maintained, and filled with the kind of warm light that spilled from windows at night, telling stories of home-cooked meals and homework sessions and the small rituals that made a house into something more. Maeve sat in the passenger seat of Julian's truck, staring at the house through the windshield, her body coiled with tension despite her exhaustion. Every instinct she'd developed over 8 years of military service, every survival mechanism that had kept her alive through 2 deployments and 6 months of hell at Grandview Manor, was screaming at her to run. Accepting help from strangers was dangerous. Entering unfamiliar territory without backup was dangerous. Trusting someone she'd known for less than an hour was dangerous. But staying on the streets was dangerous too, and she was so tired of being afraid. "That's home," Julian said quietly, following her gaze to the house. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry, and the couch is more comfortable than it looks." Through one of the downstairs windows, Maeve could see the flickering light of a television, and her stomach clenched with a familiar anxiety. "Your daughter," she said. "You said you have a daughter." "Sophia," Julian confirmed, his voice softening the way it always did when he talked about his kid. "She's 15. Probably fell asleep doing homework again, which means I'll find her textbooks scattered across the kitchen table and her curled up on the couch with the remote in her hand." Maeve's hand tightened on the strap of her duffel bag. "Maybe this isn't a good idea. I don't want to scare her, or you won't scare her," Julian interrupted gently. "Sophia's been raised around strong women. Her mom was a nurse before ... double quotes." He paused, then continued. "Before she decided that small-town life wasn't what she wanted. Sophia understands that sometimes people need help, and she'd never forgive me if I left someone out in the cold." But Maeve wasn't convinced. She'd seen the way people looked at her lately, the way her appearance had changed during her time at Grandview, the way trauma had carved itself into the lines around her eyes, and the careful way she moved through the world. She looked like someone who had been broken, and broken people made others uncomfortable, especially teenagers who were still figuring out their own place in the world. Julian seemed to sense her hesitation. "Tell you what," he said, turning off the truck's engine. "Let me go in first, make sure Sophia's awake and knows what's happening. You can wait here, or on the porch, whatever makes you comfortable. No pressure, no expectations. If you change your mind, I'll drive you wherever you want to go." The kindness in his voice almost undid her. When was the last time someone had given her choices instead of ultimatums? When was the last time someone had cared more about her comfort than their own convenience? "Okay," Maeve said, her voice barely audible. "I'll wait on the porch." Julian nodded and climbed out of the truck, leaving the keys in the ignition, a gesture of trust that didn't go unnoticed. He was telling her, without words, that she could leave if she needed to, that he wasn't trapping her, that her agency mattered more than his desire to help. Maeve followed him to the front porch, her boots making soft sounds against the wooden steps. The porch was decorated with the kind of practical touches that spoke of a man raising the daughter alone: a small table with a coffee-stained mug, a pair of sneakers kicked off beside the door, a wind chime that had seen better days but still caught the night breeze with gentle musical notes. "I'll be right back," Julian said, and disappeared through the front door. Alone on the porch, Maeve set her duffel bag down and wrapped her arms around herself, listening to the muffled sounds of conversation from inside the house. Julian's voice, low and reassuring. A younger voice, Sophia's, asking questions that Maeve couldn't quite make out. Then footsteps, movement, the soft sound of someone cleaning up what was probably homework scattered across a kitchen table. Through the front window, Maeve caught glimpses of the life that existed inside these walls. Books stacked on side tables, family photos on the mantel, a pair of reading glasses forgotten on the arm of a well-worn recliner. It was the kind of home that had been built through years of small moments, daily choices to care for each other, the accumulation of love and responsibility that created something solid and safe. When Julian returned, he was carrying a steaming mug and had traded his work jacket for a clean flannel shirt. "Sophia made hot chocolate," he said, offering Maeve the mug. "She says it's the good stuff with the little marshmallows." Maeve accepted the mug with hands that shook slightly, whether from cold or emotion she couldn't say. The ceramic was warm against her palms, and the sweet scent of chocolate and vanilla rose like a small piece of childhood she'd thought she'd lost forever. "She wants to meet you," Julian continued, settling into one of the porch chairs. "But only if you're comfortable with it. She understands that you've had a long night." "What did you tell her?" Maeve asked, taking a cautious sip of the hot chocolate. It was perfect, rich and sweet, and exactly the kind of thing a thoughtful teenager would make for a stranger who needed something warm and comforting. "The truth," Julian said. "That I met someone who needed help, and that helping people is what we do in this family." I didn't give her details, and I won't unless you want me to. Your story is yours to tell. Maeve felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. "She's not afraid?" Julian smiled, the expression transforming his tired face into something younger, more hopeful. "Sophia's not afraid of much. She gets that from her mom, I guess. The good parts of her mom, anyway." He paused, studying Maeve's face in the porch light. "She asked if you were a soldier, and when I said yes, she said she's been wanting to talk to someone who's served. She's thinking about joining up after high school." "Oh," Maeve said, surprised by the information. That's a big decision." "Yeah, it is. And I'd be lying if I said the idea doesn't scare the hell out of me. But Sophia's got her own mind, always has. She wants to serve something bigger than herself, wants to make a difference in the world." Julian's voice carried a mixture of pride and worry that Maeve recognized, the complex emotions of someone who loved a person brave enough to choose difficult paths. The front door opened, and a teenage girl appeared in the doorway. Sophia Underwood had her father's dark hair and sturdy build, but her eyes held a warmth and curiosity that spoke of someone who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of the world. She was wearing flannel pajama pants and an oversized high school sweatshirt, looking every inch the normal teenager except for the intelligence in her gaze as she assessed the situation. "Hi," Sophia said, her voice friendly but respectful. "I'm Sophia. Dad says you might need a place to crash tonight." "I'm Maeve," she replied, standing up from her chair. "And yes, your dad's been very kind. Thank you for the hot chocolate." "No problem. Are you really in the army?" "I am," Maeve confirmed, something in the girl's straightforward manner putting her at ease. 8 years in logistics. Sophia's eyes lit up with genuine interest. "That's so cool. I've been reading about different military careers, and logistics sounds really important. Like, armies can't function without people who know how to get supplies where they need to go, right?" For the first time in months, Maeve found herself smiling, really smiling. Not the careful expression she'd learned to wear like armor. "That's exactly right. Wars are won and lost based on who can move people and equipment most efficiently. See, Dad?" Sophia said, grinning at Julian. "I told you logistics was cool." Julian held up his hands in mock surrender. "I never said it wasn't cool. I just said it was complicated." "Everything worthwhile is complicated," Sophia replied with the confident wisdom of 15 years. Then, turning back to Maeve, she added, "The couch really is comfortable, and the bathroom's right down the hall. There are clean towels in the closet if you want a shower, and Dad makes amazing pancakes for breakfast." "Sophia," Julian warned. Gently. "What?" "I'm just being hospitable." Sophia grinned again, then looked at Maeve with an expression that was suddenly more serious. "But really, you're safe here. Dad's one of the good ones, and I promise we're not weird or anything." "Well, I'm a little weird, but in a good way." Despite everything, Maeve laughed a real laugh that surprised her with its genuineness. "Thank you," she said. "Both of you. I haven't had people be this kind to me in a long time." "Then you've been hanging around the wrong people," Sophia declared with teenage certainty. "Come on, let me show you where everything is." And as Maeve followed Julian and his daughter into their warm, cluttered, imperfect home, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, the world still contained people who helped without expecting anything in return. That morning came to the Underwood house the way it always did, with the smell of coffee brewing in an automatic pot that Julian had programmed the night before, the sound of Sophia's alarm clock going off 3 times before she actually got out of bed, and the gentle chaos of a family getting ready for another day. But this morning was different, because there was someone new sleeping on the living room couch, someone who had spent the night curled up under Julian's mother's old quilt, finally getting the kind of rest that comes when you're truly safe. Maeve woke to the sound of muffled conversation in the kitchen and the rich aroma of bacon frying in a pan. For a moment, she lay still with her eyes closed, listening to the domestic symphony of a real home. Julian's deep voice explaining something about carburetors, Sophia's laughter bubbling up in response, the clink of dishes being moved around, the hiss of something cooking on the stove. It was the kind of morning soundtrack she'd dreamed about during long nights in military barracks and transitional housing, the sound of belonging that she'd started to believe was reserved for other people. When she finally sat up, folding the quilt carefully around her shoulders, she found Julian standing in the kitchen doorway with a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. He was already dressed for work in clean jeans and a flannel shirt, his dark hair still damp from the shower, and there was something about the way he looked at her, checking to make sure she was okay without making her feel like a burden, that made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Morning," Julian said quietly, careful not to wake her too abruptly. "Sleep okay?" "Better than I have in months," Maeve admitted, accepting the coffee he offered with grateful hands. The first sip was perfect, strong enough to wake her up, sweet enough to remind her that some people still believed in small kindnesses. "Dad makes the best coffee in 3 counties, Sophia announced from the kitchen, appearing in the doorway, with a plate of scrambled eggs and toast balanced in her hands. "It's like his superpower, except instead of fighting crime, he fights morning grumpiness." Maeve found herself smiling despite the lingering fog of sleep. That's a pretty valuable superpower, right? I keep telling him he could probably make millions if he bottled the secret and sold it to coffee shops. Sophia settled cross-legged on the floor beside the couch, her own plate balanced on her knees. But he says the secret ingredient is getting up at 5:30 every morning, and nobody wants to pay for that. Smart girl, Julian said, ruffling his daughter's hair as he passed. Too smart for her own good sometimes. The easy banter between father and daughter was like watching a well-rehearsed dance, the kind of comfortable intimacy that came from years of just the two of them against the world. But instead of making Maeve feel like an outsider, they included her naturally, asking about her preferences for breakfast, making space for her at their kitchen table, treating her like a welcome guest rather than an unexpected burden, over pancakes that were indeed as amazing as Sophia had promised. Maeve found herself relaxing in ways she'd forgotten were possible. Julian told stories about the more interesting repair jobs that came through. Patterson's heavy equipment, the farmer who'd somehow managed to get a tractor stuck halfway up a tree, the construction crew that had accidentally buried their own bulldozer, while Sophia provided running commentary and increasingly elaborate theories about how such disasters could occur. I swear, Julian said, gesturing with his fork, some days I think my job is less about fixing machines and more about figuring out how people manage to break them in ways that defy the laws of physics. Like that time Mrs. Henderson somehow got her riding mower tangled up in her Christmas lights in July, Sophia added, grinning at the memory. In July? Maeve asked, caught up in the story despite herself. She claimed she was testing them early, Julian explained. But I think she was just trying to mow around the lights without taking them down first. Did it work? Well, she definitely solved her problem of having too many Christmas lights, Sophia said. Dad had to cut about half of them out of the mower blades. The conversation flowed easily from there, covering everything from Sophia's upcoming history project on World War II. I'm writing about the logistics of D-Day, thanks to our conversation last night, to Julian's plans for fixing the front porch steps before winter really set in. They asked Maeve about her military experience, but gently, letting her share what she was comfortable with, rather than pushing for details she wasn't ready to give. When Maeve mentioned that she'd managed supply chains for forward operating bases, Sophia's eyes lit up with genuine fascination. So you basically had to figure out how to get everything from ammunition to toilet paper to the right place at the right time, even when people were shooting at you. That's a pretty accurate summary, Maeve said, touched by the teenager's earnest interest. It's like solving a really complicated puzzle, except the pieces keep changing, and some of them are on fire. That sounds simultaneously terrifying and awesome, Sophia declared. Like being a chess master and a firefighter at the same time. I never thought of it that way, but yeah, that's not a bad comparison. Julian watched the exchange with something that looked like pride, not just in his daughter's curiosity and intelligence, but in the way Maeve was opening up, sharing pieces of herself that probably hadn't seen daylight in months. There was color in her cheeks now, warmth in her voice. And when she laughed at one of Sophia's observations, it was the kind of genuine sound that made the whole house seem brighter. After breakfast, while Julian got ready for work, Sophia showed Maeve around the house with the kind of enthusiastic tour guide energy that only teenagers could maintain. She pointed out her favorite reading spots. This chair by the window gets the best light in the afternoon. Explained the quirks of the old house. The bathroom door sticks, but if you lift the handle while you pull, it opens fine. And shared the locations of everything Maeve might need during the day. Dad usually gets home around 6, Sophia said as they stood in the kitchen. But sometimes jobs run late. I can handle myself after school. I've been doing it for years. But it might be nice to have some company for once. You want me to stay? Maeve asked, surprised by the offer. Well, yeah, I mean, if you want to. Dad didn't say it directly, but I could tell he was worried about leaving you here alone all day. Not because he doesn't trust you, Sophia added quickly, but because he's like that. He worries about people. Julian appeared in the doorway, truck keys jingling in his hand. You two plotting something? Just making sure Maeve knows she's welcome to hang around today, Sophia said. I told her you'd probably worry yourself into a distraction if you thought. She was wandering around town with nowhere to go, Sophia. Julian said with mild exasperation, but there was affection in his voice. What? It's true. You worry about everyone. Remember when Mrs. Chun from down the street had her hip surgery, and you basically adopted her yard maintenance until she was back on her feet? Maeve looked between father and daughter, seeing the deep affection and understanding that bound them together. These were people who took care of others because that's who they were, not because they expected anything in return. It was a foreign concept after months of dealing with people who saw her vulnerability as an opportunity to take advantage. The offer stands, Julian said to Maeve, his voice gentle. No pressure, but if you want to stick around for the day. Sophia's right. The company would probably be good for both of you. Looking at their faces, Julian's careful hopefulness, Sophia's open enthusiasm, Maeve felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she wanted to stay somewhere not because she had to, but because she was wanted. I'd like that, she said quietly. If you're sure I won't be in the way. In the way of what? Sophia scoffed. Watching cooking shows and pretending to do homework? Trust me, you'll definitely be an improvement to my day. As Julian kissed his daughter goodbye and headed off to work, Maeve found herself settling into the rhythm of the Underwood household as if she'd always belonged there. And for the first time since everything had gone wrong, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to be part of something like this. Something real, something safe, something that felt like home. The afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen windows of the Underwood house, casting golden rectangles across the worn wooden table where Maeve and Sophia sat with textbooks spread between them like a battlefield of teenage academic ambition. What had started as Sophia working on her World War II project had evolved into something deeper, a genuine conversation about leadership, sacrifice, and the weight of making decisions that affected other people's lives. I keep reading about these generals who had to choose between saving their own troops and completing the mission, Sophia said, tapping her pencil against her notebook. How do you even make a decision like that? How do you live with yourself? Afterward? Maeve stared at the passage Sophia was reading, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest. That came whenever she was forced to confront the complexities of military service that most civilians never had to consider. You make the best decision you can with the information you have, she said carefully. And then you carry the weight of it for the rest of your life. But that's not fair, Sophia protested with the passionate certainty of someone who still believed the world should make sense. The people making those decisions didn't ask for that responsibility. No, Maeve agreed quietly. They didn't. But that's what leadership means in the military. You accept responsibility for things that are bigger than you, scarier than you, and sometimes impossible to solve perfectly. Sophia studied Maeve's face with the perceptive intelligence that seemed to run in the Underwood family. You had to make decisions like that, didn't you? Maeve was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee mug. Through the kitchen window, she could see the neighbor's dog chasing leaves in the wind, the kind of simple joy that felt like a luxury when you'd spent years worrying about life and death consequences every single day. Once, Maeve said finally, I was responsible for getting medical supplies to a forward operating base that had taken casualties. There were two routes, one that was faster but more dangerous, and one that was safer but would take longer. I chose the safe route, thinking I was protecting my team. She paused, swallowing hard. 3 soldiers died waiting for those supplies. They might have lived if I'd taken the risk. Sophia's pencil stilled in her hand. That wasn't your fault. Wasn't it? Maeve asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I had the information, I had the authority to make the call, and I chose wrong. You chose based on what you thought was best at the time, Sophia said firmly. That's all anyone can do. Those soldiers, they knew the risks when they signed up, just like you did. You can't carry the weight of every bad thing that happens. The wisdom in the teenager's voice caught Maeve off guard. This wasn't empty comfort or platitudes. This was someone who had clearly thought deeply about responsibility and consequences, who understood that the world was more complicated than heroes and villains. How did you get so smart? Maeve asked, managing a small smile. Dad, Sophia said simply. He taught me that blaming yourself for things you can't control is just another way of giving up. He should know he spent about 2 years doing it after Mom left. The mention of Julian's ex-wife hung in the air between them, and Maeve found herself curious despite her instinct to avoid getting too involved in other people's personal histories. What happened, if you don't mind me asking? Sophia glanced toward the front door, as if checking to make sure her father wasn't about to walk in and hear this conversation. Mom was a nurse, she said. Really good at her job, really passionate about helping people. But after I was born, she started feeling trapped. Like she was missing out on something bigger. Something more important than changing diapers and dealing with small-town life. That must have been hard on your dad. It was hard on all of us, Sophia corrected. But Dad blamed himself. He thought, if he'd been a better husband, made more money, been more interesting somehow, she would have stayed. He couldn't see that it wasn't about him. It was about her needing something he couldn't give her. Maeve felt a familiar ache in her chest, the recognition of someone else who carried guilt that wasn't entirely theirs to bear. How long ago did she leave? 3 years, Sophia said. Right after my 12th birthday. She said she needed to find herself, whatever that means. Last we heard, she was working for Doctors Without Borders in Guatemala, saving the world one patient at a time. Do you miss her? Sophia considered the question seriously. I miss the idea of her, you know. I miss having a mom who wanted to be here. But I don't miss the actual her. The one who was always looking out the window like she was waiting for her real life to start somewhere else. The maturity in Sophia's voice broke Maeve's heart. This was a girl who had learned too young that love wasn't always enough to keep people where they belonged. That sometimes the people who were supposed to protect you ended up being the ones who left you behind. I'm sorry, Maeve said. You deserved better than that. Yeah, well, Sophia shrugged, but Maeve could see the pain beneath the casual gesture. Dad more than makes up for it. He's never made me feel like I was holding him back or keeping him from something better. Even when things get really tough. Even when he's working double shifts just to keep the lights on, he never makes me feel like a burden. You're not a burden, Maeve said firmly. You're the best thing that ever happened to him. Anyone can see that just by watching you two together. I know, Sophia said with a smile that was both confident and vulnerable. But it's nice to hear. If from someone else. Dad doesn't really date. I think he's afraid of bringing someone into our lives who might leave again. He's protecting both of us, but sometimes I wonder if he's protecting us right out of any chance at happiness. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a truck pulling into the driveway, and Sophia glanced at the clock with surprise. He's early. Jobs must have finished ahead of schedule. Julian came through the front door a few minutes later, looking tired but pleased to find Maeve still there. His eyes went first to his daughter, checking automatically to make sure she was okay, then to Maeve, and she saw something soft and grateful in his expression. How was your day? He asked, hanging his jacket on the hook by the door. Educational, Sophia said with a grin. Maeve's been helping me understand the logistics of military operations. Did you know that most wars are actually won or lost based on who can manage their supply chains better? I did not know that, Julian said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. But it makes sense. You can't fight if you don't have ammunition, food, or medical supplies. Exactly, Maeve said. People think war is all about the dramatic battles, but really it's about 1,000 small decisions that happen behind the scenes. Whether supplies reach the right place at the right time, whether troops have the equipment they need, whether communication lines stay open. Julian studied her face as she spoke, noting the way her voice grew more confident when she talked about her area of expertise, the way her military training showed through in her precise language and clear thinking. Sounds like a lot of pressure. It was, Maeve admitted, especially when things went wrong. When you're responsible for other people's lives, every mistake feels enormous. I can imagine, Julian said quietly. I get anxious enough when I'm just responsible for fixing someone's equipment. I can't imagine having that responsibility for actual people. There was understanding in his voice, the recognition of someone who knew what it felt like to carry weight that sometimes felt too heavy to bear alone. Maeve found herself looking at him differently, not just as the kind stranger who had picked her up on a dark highway, but as someone who understood the particular burden of being responsible for others. You carry plenty of responsibility, Maeve said, nodding toward Sophia. Single parenthood isn't exactly low pressure. Yeah, but that's different, Julian said. That's my kid. I signed up for that responsibility the day she was born. You were taking care of people who weren't your family, people you might not have even known very well. They became family, Maeve said simply. When you're deployed together, when you're depending on each other to stay alive, it doesn't matter. If you knew them before, you become responsible for each other. Sophia looked between her father and Maeve, seeing something in their interaction that made her smile. You two are a lot alike, she observed. You both think taking care of people is more important than taking care of yourselves. That's not, Julian started to protest. Dad, you literally gave up your own dinner last week because I was still hungry and we were running low on groceries before payday, Sophia interrupted. And Maeve, I'm betting you volunteered for dangerous assignments because you couldn't stand the idea of sending someone else into harm's way. Both adults were quiet, caught in the accuracy of the teenager's assessment. It's not a bad thing, Sophia continued. It's just something you should probably be aware of. Because people who are always taking care of everyone else sometimes forget that they deserve to be taken care of too. The wisdom in her words hung in the air between them, and Maeve felt something shift in her understanding of this family. Julian wasn't just a kind stranger who had offered help, he was someone who understood the weight of responsibility, the burden of always putting others first, the particular loneliness that came from being the person everyone else depended on. You raised a very smart kid, Maeve told Julian. She raised herself mostly, Julian replied, pride evident in his voice. I just tried not to mess her up too badly. You didn't mess me up at all, Sophia said firmly. You taught me that taking care of people matters, that keeping your word matters, that being kind is more important than being impressive. Those are pretty good lessons. Maeve felt her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. When was the last time she'd been part of a conversation like this, honest, caring, full of the kind of love that didn't need to announce itself because it was woven into every word, every gesture, every glance? I should probably figure out what I'm doing tomorrow, Maeve said, though the words felt heavy in her mouth. I can't keep imposing on your hospitality. You're not imposing, Julian said quickly. And honestly, I'm not comfortable with the idea of you going back to that place. Grandview Manor isn't an option, Maeve agreed. But I need to find work, find a more permanent place to stay. I can't rebuild my life from your couch. Why not? Sophia asked. I mean, why not stay here while you figure things out? It's not like we don't have the space, and it's been really nice having someone else around. Julian looked at his daughter, then at Maeve, something complicated passing across his features. Sophia's right, there's no rush. Take the time you need to figure out what comes next. Maeve wanted to accept, wanted it so badly it frightened her. But accepting meant trusting, and trust was a luxury she'd learned she couldn't afford. Still, looking at their faces, seeing the genuine care in their eyes, she found herself nodding. Maybe a few more days, she said quietly. Just until I can get my bearings. Good, Sophia said with satisfaction. Because I still have about 1,000,000 questions about military logistics, and Dad's been needing someone to help him fix that wobbly porch step. As evening settled over the Underwood house, Maeve found herself thinking that maybe, just maybe, she had stumbled into something she hadn't even known she was looking for. Not just shelter from the storm, but a place where her presence was wanted, where her experience was valued, where the weight of her past didn't make her a burden to be carried, but a person to be cherished. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope that tomorrow might be better than today. 3 days had passed since Maeve Wood had first stepped into the Underwood house, and with each sunrise, the temporary arrangement felt less temporary and more like something dangerously close to belonging. She had settled into routines that felt natural, making coffee before Julian left for work, helping Sophia with homework in the afternoons, cooking dinner that filled the house with warmth and the kind of domestic contentment that made her forget, for hours at a time, that this wasn't really her life, but forgetting was a luxury she couldn't afford. And the weight of what she hadn't told them pressed against her chest like a physical ache every time Julian smiled at her over morning coffee, every time Sophia asked for another story about military life, every time either of them looked at her like she was someone worth keeping around. The call came on a Thursday morning while Julian was at work and Sophia was at school. Maeve had been reading on the front porch, enjoying the crisp November air and the peaceful quiet of Birchwood Lane, when her phone, the prepaid one she'd bought with cash 3 states ago, buzzed with an unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers had become synonymous with danger in her world, with people who wanted to find her for reasons that had nothing to do with her well-being. But something made her thumb the green button, and she immediately regretted it. Staff Sergeant Wood. The voice was crisp, official, unmistakably military. This is Colonel Martinez from Fort Brennan's Criminal Investigation Division. We need to speak with you regarding an ongoing investigation. Maeve's blood turned to ice in her veins. She gripped the phone so tightly, her knuckles went white, her eyes automatically scanning the street for any sign of official vehicles, any indication that they had found her. I don't know what you're talking about, she managed, though her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. Ma'am, we have reason to believe you may have information relevant to our investigation into irregularities at the Grandview Manor Transitional Facility. Your cooperation would be appreciated. I already gave my statement, Maeve said, standing up from the porch chair and moving toward the front door. I told your people everything I knew before I left. New evidence has come to light, Colonel. Martinez continued, his tone professional but insistent. Evidence that suggests your departure from the facility may have been precipitated by more than just dissatisfaction with the program. Maeve's hand shook as she turned the doorknob, seeking the safety of the house's interior. I don't have anything else to say. Staff Sergeant Wood, I need to impress upon you the serious nature of this investigation. We're talking about federal charges, potential court-martial proceedings for multiple individuals. Your testimony could be crucial to ensuring justice is served. Justice, Maeve repeated, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. Where was justice 6 months ago when I filed my first complaint? Where was justice when I requested a transfer and was told I was being oversensitive? Where was justice when she stopped herself, realizing she was saying too much, revealing too much? Ma'am, I understand your frustration, but running away isn't going to solve anything. We need you to come in, to tell us exactly what happened. During your time at Grandview Manor, there are other victims, Staff Sergeant. Other women who were hurt by the same people who hurt you. The words hit Maeve like a physical blow. Other victims. She had suspected as much, had seen the fear in other women's eyes, had heard the whispered conversations that stopped when certain staff members walked by. But hearing it confirmed, knowing that her silence might be enabling continued abuse, made her stomach clench with guilt and rage. "I can't," she whispered into the phone. "I can't come back there." "We can arrange to meet somewhere else," Colonel Martinez said, his voice softening slightly. "Somewhere you feel safe. We know this is difficult, Staff Sergeant, but we also know that you're stronger than you think. Your service record speaks to that. You've faced enemy fire, managed critical supply operations under impossible conditions. You can face this too." Maeve closed her eyes, leaning against the front door of Julian's house. A house that wasn't hers. A life that wasn't hers. Safety that was borrowed and temporary and built on the foundation of lies by omission. "I need time to think," she said. "Finally, time is a luxury we may not have," Colonel Martinez replied. "Our sources suggest that certain individuals are becoming aware of our investigation. If they destroy evidence, if they intimidate other witnesses, we may lose our chance to hold them accountable." "How did you find me?" Maeve asked, though she was afraid of the answer. "You used your real name at a bus station in Millfield. Security cameras, credit card transactions. It's harder to disappear completely than most people realize." Maeve's heart sank. If the military investigators could find her, that meant others could too. Others who had more to lose if she talked, who might be motivated by more than just justice. "I'll call you back," she said, and ended the call before Colonel Martinez could respond. She stood in Julian's entryway, surrounded by the evidence of his and Sophia's life together, family photos on the side table, Sophia's jacket hanging on a hook, Julian's work boots lined up neatly by the door, and felt like an imposter. Worse than an imposter, a danger. By staying here, by allowing herself to care about these people and letting them care about her, she was potentially putting them at risk. The afternoon passed in a haze of anxiety and guilt. When Sophia came home from school, chattering about her history project and a boy in her chemistry class who had asked her to study together, Maeve found herself memorizing the details, the way Sophia's eyes lit up when she talked about something she was passionate about, the casual way she kicked off her shoes and draped herself across the living room furniture, the easy intimacy of a teenager who felt completely safe in her own home. "You okay?" Sophia asked eventually, pausing in her discussion of the Battle of Normandy to study Maeve's face. "You seem distracted." "Just thinking," Maeve said, forcing a smile. "Sorry, go on." "You were saying something about the weather affecting the landing." "But—" Sophia wasn't fooled. She had her father's perceptive nature, and she could read tension in people the way other teenagers read social media posts. "Is something wrong? Did something happen today?" Maeve opened her mouth to lie, to offer some bland reassurance that would keep Sophia from worrying. But looking at this girl who had welcomed her with such open generosity, who had shared her home and her father and her genuine affection without reservation, the words wouldn't come. "Someone called," Maeve said finally. "Someone from my old unit. They want me to come back, to testify about what happened at Grandview Manor." Sophia's expression grew serious. "The place you were staying before, the one that was supposed to help veterans?" "Yes, there's an investigation now apparently. They need witnesses." "That's good, right?" Sophia asked. "If something bad was happening there, people should be held accountable." "It's complicated," Maeve said, though even as she said it, she knew how inadequate the explanation was. "Going back means facing people who hurt me. It means reliving things I'd rather forget. And it means—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "It means leaving here. It means giving up this illusion of safety and family and belonging. It means leaving us," Sophia said quietly, understanding without needing the words spelled out. Maeve felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. I can't ask you and your father to get involved in this. If there are people who don't want me to testify, people with something to lose, staying here could put you both in danger. Dad's not going to see it that way, Sophia said with the confidence of someone who knew her father's character down to his bones. Dad's going to say that doing the right thing is worth the risk, and that we're not the kind of people who abandon someone when things get scary. The truth of it hit Maeve like a physical blow. Julian would want her to stay, would want to help, would probably offer to drive her to wherever she needed to go to give her testimony. He would see it as the right thing to do, the moral choice, because that's who he was, someone who helped people, even when it was inconvenient, even when it was dangerous. The sound of Julian's truck in the driveway sent a spike of panic through Maeve's chest. How could she look at him across the dinner table, knowing what she knew now? How could she let him continue to care about her while she sat on information that could potentially put his family at risk? Julian came through the front door with his usual tired smile, but it faded when he saw the expressions on their faces. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, his eyes going first to Sophia, then to Maeve. "Maeve got a call today," Sophia said, because apparently the Underwood family believed in directness even when it hurt. "From the military, about testifying against the people who hurt her." Julian's jaw tightened, and Maeve saw something dangerous. Flash in his eyes, not directed at her, but at the faceless people who had made that call, who had tracked her down and shattered the peace she'd found in his home. What did they want? He asked quietly. Maeve found herself telling him everything: the investigation, the other victims, the pressure to return and testify, the implication that dangerous people might be looking for witnesses. She watched his face as she spoke, saw the way his protective instincts warred with his respect for her autonomy, the way he processed the information and began making plans to keep his family safe while still supporting her. "You have to testify," he said finally, and the certainty in his voice surprised her. "Julian, you don't understand. If I do this, if I go back, it could bring trouble here." People might what?" Julian interrupted. "Come after a mechanic and his teenage daughter in a small town. Let them come. I'm not afraid of bullies, Maeve, whether they wear uniforms or not." "You have Sophia to think about," Maeve protested. "I am thinking about Sophia," Julian said firmly. "I'm thinking about the kind of world I want her to grow up in, the kind of lessons I want her to learn about standing up for what's right. I'm thinking about the fact that if we don't help you do this, other women are going to suffer the way you suffered." Sophia nodded emphatically. "Dad's right. You can't let them get away with it just because you're scared. And you can't protect us by leaving. You can protect us by letting us help you be brave." Maeve looked at these two people who had become so important to her so quickly, who were willing to risk their own safety for principles that mattered more than comfort or convenience. Part of her wanted to accept their support, to lean into their strength and courage. But a bigger part of her, the part that had been shaped by months of betrayal and abuse, whispered that this was too good to be true, that people like Julian and Sophia didn't really exist, that their kindness would evaporate the moment things got truly difficult. "I need to think about it," she said finally, though they all knew there was really only one choice she could make if she wanted to live with herself. That night, lying on the couch that had become her temporary refuge, Maeve stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine a future where she was brave enough to do the right thing, strong enough to trust the people who had shown her nothing but kindness, and worthy of the family that seemed to want her to stay. But the phone call had shattered something fragile inside her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that by morning, everything would change, and not for the better. The knock came at exactly 7:30 on Friday evening. 3 sharp raps that cut through the comfortable domesticity of the Underwood family dinner like a blade through silk. Julian was telling Sophia out a particularly stubborn engine he'd spent the day wrestling with, while Maeve pushed food around her plate, her appetite diminished by 24 hours of anxiety about the phone call from Colonel Martinez. The sound made all three of them freeze, forks suspended halfway to mouths, because there was something official about those knocks, something that spoke of uniforms and authority and news that couldn't wait for a more convenient time. Julian was the first to move, setting down his napkin with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. "I'll get it," he said quietly, his eyes meeting Maeve's across the table. She had gone pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table like she might need to run any moment. "It's okay," Sophia said softly, reaching across to touch Maeve's arm. "Whatever it is, we'll handle it together." Through the front window, Julian could see a black sedan parked at the curb, government plates glinting in the porch light. His stomach clenched with protective anger as he opened the door to find a woman in army dress uniform standing on his doorstep, her posture ramrod straight, her expression carefully neutral. She was perhaps 50, with steel gray hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The modest house, Julian's protective stance in the doorway, the sound of voices from the kitchen. "Behind him, Mr. Underwood?" she asked, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I'm Colonel Genesis Sanchez, United States Army. I'm here to speak with Staff Sergeant Maeve Wood." Julian's jaw tightened. "She's not. I'm here." Maeve's voice came from behind him, steady despite the fear Julian could hear underneath. She had appeared in the hallway, Sophia beside her, both women standing together like they were facing a firing squad. "Colonel Sanchez, I wasn't expecting you. May I come in, Staff Sergeant? What I have to discuss is best said in private." Julian wanted to refuse, wanted to close the door and protect the fragile peace that had settled over his home these past few days. But he could see in Maeve's face that running wasn't an option anymore, that whatever had brought this colonel to his door was going to have to be faced here and now. "Of course," Maeve said, stepping aside. "Please come in." Colonel Sanchez entered, with the measured pace of someone who had delivered both commendations and death notifications, who understood the weight that words could carry and the lives they could change. She declined Julian's offer of coffee, declined the invitation to sit, instead standing in the living room with her hands clasped behind her back, her gaze fixed on Maeve with an intensity that made the air feel charged with electricity. "Staff Sergeant Wood," she began, "I'm not here about the Grandview Manor investigation, though I'm aware Colonel Martinez has been in contact with you regarding that matter. I'm here about something else entirely, something that should have been addressed 18 months ago, but was buried by people who had more interest in protecting their own careers than in recognizing the heroism of the soldiers under their command." Maeve's face went white. "I don't understand." "Operation Desert Rose," Colonel Sanchez said, and Julian saw Maeve flinch as if she'd been struck. "March 15th, 2023. Do you remember that date, Staff Sergeant?" "I remember," Maeve whispered, her voice barely audible. Sophia moved closer to her father, instinctively seeking comfort in his presence as the adults in the room navigated whatever minefield they had stumbled into. Julian put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, his eyes never leaving Maeve's face. "Tell me what you remember," Colonel Sanchez continued, her voice softer now but no less commanding. Maeve was quiet for a long moment, her hands shaking slightly as she wrapped her arms around herself. When she spoke, her voice was hollow, distant, like she was recounting someone else's nightmare. "It was supposed to be a routine supply run," she said. "Medical supplies and ammunition to Forward Operating Base Kilo. I was leading a convoy of 4 vehicles, 12 personnel total. We had intelligence that the route was clear, that insurgent activity in the area was minimal." She paused, swallowing hard, and Julian found himself moving closer to her without conscious thought, his protective instincts overriding everything else. The intelligence was wrong, Maeve continued. We hit an IED about halfway to the base, and then came under heavy fire from multiple positions. The lead vehicle was disabled, 3 soldiers wounded, 1 critically. We were pinned down with no cover, no way to call for immediate backup because our communications equipment was damaged in the blast. Colonel Sanchez nodded grimly. And what did you do, Staff Sergeant? I did what I had to do, Maeve said, her voice growing stronger. I organized a defensive perimeter, got the wounded to the only available cover, and realized that if we stayed where we were all going to die. The insurgents had us outgunned and surrounded. So I took 2 volunteers, and we flanked their position while the rest of the squad provided covering fire. You took 2 volunteers on a suicide mission, Colonel Sanchez corrected. According to the after-action reports I've read, you gave your soldiers direct orders to retreat with the wounded if you didn't return within 30 minutes. Julian felt his chest tighten with a mixture of pride and horror as he began to understand what Maeve had done, what kind of person he had brought into his home. We neutralized the insurgent position, Maeve said quietly. All 12 soldiers made it home alive. Mission accomplished. Mission accomplished, Colonel Sanchez agreed, with no casualties, thanks to your leadership and tactical decisions. What happened next, Staff Sergeant? Maeve's face darkened. My commanding officer decided that my actions were reckless and endangered military personnel unnecessarily. He wrote up the incident as a failure of leadership rather than an act of heroism. Sighed, I should have waited for backup, should have followed protocol, should have prioritized the safety of my soldiers over completing the mission. Even though waiting for backup would have resulted in casualties, even though waiting for backup would have gotten us all killed, Maeve said bitterly. But Major Henderson was more concerned with covering his own ass than with the truth. He was the one who approved the faulty intelligence, who sent us into a known danger zone without adequate support. Blaming me for reckless leadership was easier than admitting he'd screwed up. Julian felt rage building in his chest, hot and protective and directed at people he'd never met but already hated. So they punished her for saving lives? They did more than that, Colonel Sanchez said, her voice grim. They buried the true account of what happened, intimidated the soldiers who wanted to speak on Staff Sergeant Wood's behalf, and when she continued to push for an accurate accounting of events, they began a campaign of retaliation that eventually led to her assignment at Grandview Manor. The pieces clicked into place for Julian with sickening clarity. They sent her to that place as punishment. Grandview Manor was supposed to be a legitimate transitional facility, Colonel Sanchez explained. But certain individuals saw it as an opportunity to discourage veterans from pursuing complaints against their former commanders. Staff Sergeant Wood wasn't the only soldier who ended up there after asking inconvenient questions about military justice. Sophia looked between the adults, her young face filled with horror and anger. That's not fair. That's not how the military is supposed to work. No, it's not, Colonel Sanchez agreed, which is why I'm here. 18 months ago, I was assigned to head a task force investigating irregularities in personnel assignments and disciplinary actions. It's taken us this long to uncover the full scope of the corruption, but we finally have enough evidence to act. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder, setting it on Julian's coffee table with ceremonial gravity. Staff Sergeant Wood, I'm here to inform you that Major Henderson and 3 other officers have been relieved of duty pending court-martial proceedings. The after-action report for Operation Desert Rose has been corrected to reflect the true events of that day. And I'm here to present you with the Bronze Star Medal for Valor, which should have been awarded 18 months ago. The silence that followed was deafening. Maeve stared at the folder like it might explode, her face cycling through disbelief. Vindication, and something that looked like grief for the battle she'd had to fight alone. There's more, Colonel Sanchez continued. The Army is prepared to offer you a formal apology, full reinstatement to active duty with a promotion to Sergeant First Class and your choice of assignments. We have positions available in logistics, command at the Pentagon, overseas postings in Germany or Japan, or if you prefer, leadership roles in veteran transition programs, where you could help ensure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else. Julian felt the floor drop out from under him. This was good news, great news. This was justice, vindication, the recognition that Maeve deserved. But it was also an ending, the closing of a chapter that had just begun. The answer to questions he hadn't realized he'd been afraid to ask. I need time to think, Maeve said finally, echoing the words she'd spoken the day before. Of course, Colonel Sanchez said. But I should mention that there's some urgency to the matter. We're planning to announce the court-martial proceedings next week, and having you present for the ceremony and press conference would send a powerful message about accountability and justice in the military. Next week, Maeve repeated numbly. Yes, which means that if you choose to accept reinstatement, you would need to report to Fort Braxton for processing by Monday. Monday, 4 days away. Julian felt his world tilting on its axis as he realized that everything they had built together, the tentative trust, the growing connection, the family that had started to form around their kitchen table, could disappear in less than a week. Colonel Sanchez gathered her materials and stood to leave. Staff Sergeant Wood, you've served your country with honor and distinction. What happened to you was a travesty of justice, and the Army owes you more than an apology. We owe you the recognition you've always deserved and the career you were denied. After she left, the three of them sat in Julian's living room, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built together, and tried to process the magnitude of what had just changed. Maeve had been vindicated, honored, offered everything. She had thought she'd lost forever, but sitting there in the warm lamplight, surrounded by the people who had become her family, all she could think about was that justice, finally served, might cost her the only home she'd ever truly wanted. The weekend that followed Colonel Sanchez's visit descended over the Underwood house like a storm cloud that threatened rain, but never quite delivered. Heavy, oppressive, charged with electricity. That made everyone move carefully around each other, afraid that the wrong word or gesture might trigger something that couldn't be taken back. The Bronze Star Medal sat in its presentation box on Julian's kitchen counter, a tangible reminder of honor restored in choices that needed to be made, catching the morning light like an accusation every time one of them walked past. Saturday morning brought the first wave of external pressure in the form of phone calls that started before 7 a.m. and didn't stop until well after dark. Colonel Martinez called twice, pressing Maeve for her decision about testifying in the Grandview Manor investigation. A Pentagon public affairs officer called to discuss the logistics of the awards ceremony and press conference. A reporter from Army Times somehow got her number and wanted to interview her about military justice and accountability. Each ring of the phone made all three of them flinch, made the temporary sanctuary of Birchwood Lane feel more fragile and less sustainable. You don't have to answer, Julian said after the fourth call of the morning, watching Maeve stare at her phone like it was a snake coiled to strike. You don't owe them anything on their timeline. But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. The Army had given her justice, vindication, and opportunity, things she had thought were lost forever. The weight of that gift, the obligation it created, hung between them like smoke that couldn't be cleared away no matter how many windows. They opened. Sophia handled the tension by throwing herself into research mode, a coping mechanism she had inherited from her father. She spent Saturday afternoon at her laptop, reading everything she could find about military careers, Bronze Star recipients, and the Pentagon positions that might be available to someone with Maeve's experience and newly restored reputation. Did you know that less than 2% of military personnel ever receive the Bronze Star? She asked over lunch, her voice carefully neutral as she shared information that felt like small cuts to her father's heart. And logistics command at the key. Pentagon is like, it's basically the most important job in the entire military supply chain. You'd be responsible for coordinating operations that affect thousands of soldiers. That's impressive, Julian said quietly, because what else could he say? That he wanted Maeve to turn down the opportunity of a lifetime to stay in his small town and help him fix truck engines? That he was selfish enough to want her to choose the life they had been building over the career she had earned through blood and sacrifice? Maeve pushed food around her plate, her appetite non-existent as she watched father and daughter navigate the minefield of her decision with the careful politeness of people trying not to influence something that would affect them profoundly. It is impressive, she agreed. It's everything I thought I wanted when I first enlisted. But, Sophia prompted, because even at 15, she could hear the hesitation in Maeve's voice. But that was before, Maeve said simply. Before I understood what I'd lost when I lost this. She gestured around the kitchen, encompassing not just the physical space, but everything it represented. The family dinners, the homework help, the casual intimacy of people who cared about each other's daily joys and struggles. The afternoon brought more pressure in the form of Colonel Sanchez calling to discuss travel arrangements and ceremony logistics. Maeve took the call on the front porch, pacing back and forth while Julian and Sophia tried not to eavesdrop from the living room window. The ceremony is scheduled for Wednesday, they could hear her saying. Yes, I understand the media significance. No, I haven't made my final decision about reinstatement. I appreciate the Army's patience, but I need more time to consider all my options. When she came back inside, her face was pale and her hands were shaking slightly. They want an answer by Monday morning, she said without preamble. If I'm going to accept reinstatement, I need to report to Fort Braxton for processing and medical clearance. The ceremony is Wednesday, and they want me there regardless of whether I'm returning to active duty or accepting the medal as a civilian. What do you want to do? Julian asked, though the question felt inadequate in the face of everything she was being asked to choose between. I don't know, Maeve admitted, sinking into one of the kitchen chairs. 6 months ago, this would have been easy. 6 months ago, all I wanted was my reputation back, my career back, the chance to serve again with honor. But now, she trailed off, looking around the kitchen that had become her sanctuary, at the people who had become her family, at the life she had never expected to want so desperately. Sunday brought the kind of media attention that made it impossible to pretend this was a private decision that could be made in the quiet safety of Julian's home. A news van appeared at the end of Birchwood Lane in the early morning, followed by 2 more as the day progressed. Neighbors began calling, curious about the military officials who had been visiting, the reporters who were asking questions about the war hero who had been staying with the Underwood family. This is insane, Sophia said, peering through the front curtains at the growing media presence. It's like we're under siege. Julian felt the familiar protective anger rising in his chest as he watched strangers with cameras trying to get photos of his house, his daughter, the life he had built away from public scrutiny. Maybe you should stay somewhere else until this dies down, he said to Maeve, though the words felt like swallowing glass. No, Maeve said firmly. I'm not going to. Let them drive me away from the first real home I've had since I enlisted. But I also can't ask you and Sophia to deal with this circus because of me. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. By trying to protect them, she was considering leaving them, which was exactly what the media pressure was designed to force her to do. By Sunday evening, the external pressure had reached a crescendo that made normal conversation impossible. Every topic felt loaded with significance, every casual comment a potential argument about duty versus desire, justice versus happiness, individual fulfillment versus family responsibility. They ate dinner in relative silence, the unspoken weight of Monday's deadline hanging over them like a sword. It was Sophia who finally broke the tension. setting down her fork with the decisive sound of someone who had reached the limit of polite avoidance. "This is stupid," she announced. "We're all sitting here pretending like this is just some abstract decision, like there isn't a right answer that everyone can see but no one wants to say out loud." Julian looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and trepidation. "Sophia, no, Dad, I'm tired of tiptoeing around this." She turned to Maeve, her young face fierce with determination. "You have to go back. You have to accept the medal. You have to testify about Grandview Manor, and you have to take the Pentagon job." "Sophia," Maeve said quietly, "it's not that simple." "Yes, it is," Sophia insisted. "You think staying here means choosing love over duty, but that's not what it means at all. Staying here means choosing fear over courage. You're afraid that if you leave, if you go back to being Staff Sergeant Wood instead of just Maeve who makes pancakes and helps with homework, you'll lose who you've become here. But that's not how love works." The teenager's words hit like physical blows, accurate and devastating in their clarity. "If Dad and I really love you, if this family is really real, then it doesn't disappear just because you go back to being the person you were always meant to be. Love doesn't make you smaller, Maeve. It makes you brave enough to be everything you're supposed to be." Julian stared at his daughter, seeing his ex-wife's passionate idealism combined with a wisdom that belonged entirely to Sophia herself. "When did you get so smart?" he asked. "I learned from the best," Sophia replied, but her eyes never left Maeve's face. "You taught me that doing the right thing matters more than doing the easy thing. You taught me that family means supporting each other's dreams, even when those dreams are scary or inconvenient or take people away from you." Maeve felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she looked at this remarkable girl who had somehow managed to articulate the truth that none of them had wanted to face. Sophia was right, staying would be the coward's choice, the decision to hide from responsibility behind the comfortable illusion of domestic happiness. "But what about you, too?" Maeve asked. "What about this?" She gestured around the kitchen that had become the center of their makeshift family. "This isn't going anywhere," Julian said quietly, finally finding his voice. "What we've built here, what we mean to each other, that's not dependent on geography. You're not choosing between us and your career, Maeve. You're choosing whether to trust that what we have is strong enough to survive you being everything you're meant to be." The external pressure that had been building all weekend suddenly crystallized into clarity. The media outside, the phone calls from Pentagon officials, the weight of justice delayed and finally served. All of it was pushing her toward a decision she had known was right from the moment Colonel Sanchez had placed that metal box on the coffee table. "I'm scared," Maeve admitted. "I'm scared that if I leave, if I go back to that world, I'll lose this. I'll lose you." "Then you don't understand what you've given us," Sophia said softly. "You've given us a war hero to be proud of. Someone whose courage and sacrifice made the world a little bit safer. That's not something we want to keep hidden in our kitchen. That's something we want to celebrate, something we want the whole world to know about." As Sunday night settled into Monday morning, with the deadline for her decision looming just hours away, Maeve finally understood that the external pressure she had been fighting wasn't her enemy. It was the force that would allow her to become the person she was always meant to be. Supported by a family strong enough to love her at any distance, proud enough to send her back to the fight she was born to win. The phone calls, the media attention, the weight of duty and honor and justice, all of it was calling her home to herself. And for the first time since Colonel Sanchez had knocked on their door, Maeve began to believe that home was big enough to hold both the soldier she had always been and the woman she had become in Julian's house on Birchwood Lane. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made everything seem possible and terrifying in equal measure. Maeve woke before dawn on Julian's couch, her body automatically responding to years of military conditioning, even though her mind was still clouded with the weight of the decision she had to make in less than 4 hours. Through the living room window, she could see the media van still stationed at the end of Birchwood Lane, their occupants probably drinking coffee from thermos bottles and checking their equipment, waiting for her to emerge so they could capture. Whatever choice she made for the evening news, the house was quiet around her. Julian and Sophia still sleeping, but she could smell the automatic coffee maker beginning its morning ritual in the kitchen. She had programmed it the night before, a small gesture of normalcy in the face of everything that was about to change. Rising from the couch, she wrapped Julian's mother's quilt around her shoulders and made her way to the kitchen, where she found herself staring at the Bronze Star, metal box that had become the center of their lives for the past 3 days. She opened it for what felt like the 100th time. Studying the Bronze Star with its red, white, and blue ribbon, the physical representation of courage she had demonstrated 18 months ago without even realizing it. At the time, she had just been doing her job, keeping her soldiers alive, making the best decisions she could with the information she had. She hadn't felt brave, she had felt terrified, desperate, and responsible for lives that weren't hers to lose. But looking at the medal now, in the quiet of the kitchen that had become her sanctuary, she began to understand that courage wasn't about not being afraid. Courage was about being afraid and choosing to act anyway, choosing to do what was right, even when what was right meant leaving safety behind, even when what was right meant walking back into a world that had hurt her before. "You're up early." Julian's voice came from the kitchen doorway, soft and careful in the pre-dawn quiet. He was wearing pajama pants and an old t-shirt, his hair sticking up at impossible angles, and there was something about his sleepy vulnerability that made Maeve's chest tighten with affection. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted, closing the metal box with a soft snap. "Too much thinking." Julian poured himself coffee and joined her at the kitchen table, settling into the chair across from her with the easy familiarity of someone who had learned her rhythms over the past week. "Want to talk about it?" Maeve was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the soft morning light. This man who had stopped on a dark highway for a stranger, who had opened his home and his heart without asking for anything in return, who had given her back the ability to trust that the world still contained goodness worth fighting for. "I have to go back," she said finally, the words coming out steady despite the tremor in her hands. "You know that, right? I have to accept the medal, testify about Grandview, take the Pentagon position. Sophia was right last night. Staying here would be choosing fear over courage." Julian nodded slowly, and she could see the pain in his eyes, even as he tried to hide it behind supportive understanding. "I know," he said quietly. "I've known since the moment Colonel Sanchez walked through our door. It doesn't make it easier, but I know." "I'm terrified," Maeve admitted, the words spilling out like a confession she had been holding back for days. "I'm terrified that if I leave, if I go back to being Staff Sergeant Wood instead of just Maeve who makes pancakes and helps with homework, I'll lose this. I'll lose you and Sophia and the feeling of belonging somewhere, of being part of something real." "Hey," Julian said, reaching across the table to cover her hands with his. "Look at me." She met his eyes, seeing the warmth and certainty there, the absolute conviction of someone who had made his own difficult choices and lived with the consequences. "What we have isn't that fragile," he said firmly. "Love isn't something that disappears because of distance or duty or different zip codes. You think I don't know who you are? You think I fell for some version of you that only exists in my kitchen?" Maeve felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "But what if nothing?" Julian interrupted gently. "I fell in love with a woman who put her life on the line to save her soldiers. I fell in love with someone brave enough to walk away from an abusive situation, even when she had nowhere to go. I fell in love with a person who has spent her entire adult life serving something bigger than herself. That's who you are, Maeve. That's who you've always been, whether you're wearing fatigues or making pancakes in my kitchen. Dad's right." Sophia's voice came from the kitchen doorway, and they turned to see her standing there in oversized pajamas, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her young face serious with the kind of wisdom that came from watching adults struggle with impossible choices. "You think we want some diminished version of you? Some person who gave up everything she believed in to play house with us?" "Sophia," Maeve started. "No, let me finish," Sophia said, settling into the third chair at their small table, completing the triangle that had become their family formation over the past week. "You want to know what I'm going to tell people when they ask about the war hero who stayed at our house? I'm going to tell them that Staff Sergeant Maeve Wood taught me that love means being brave enough to let the people you care about be everything they're supposed to be." The simplicity and truth of it hit Maeve like a physical blow. This 15-year-old girl had somehow managed to articulate what she herself had been struggling to understand, that real love, lasting love, wasn't about possession or keeping people small and safe. Real love was about supporting each other's courage, celebrating each other's strength, and trusting that the connection between them was strong enough to survive any distance. "I have to call Colonel Sanchez in 3 hours, Maeve said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then let's figure out what you're going to tell her," Julian said practically, because that's who he was, someone who faced problems head-on, who turned decisions into action plans, who understood that talking about courage was meaningless without the practical steps that made courage possible. They spent the next 2 hours around that kitchen table, planning Maeve's return to the world she had left behind. Julian insisted on driving her to Fort Braxton himself, refusing to let her take a bus or arrange military transport. Sophia wanted to come too, declaring that she had never seen a medal ceremony and wasn't about to miss this one. They discussed logistics, what Maeve would pack, where she would stay during the transition, how they would stay in contact during the weeks of processing and reassignment that lay ahead. But underneath the practical planning was something deeper, something that felt like a family preparing to send one of their own off to college or deployment, or any of the other transitions that tested the strength of love across distance. They were scared, all 3 of them, but they were also proud, excited, and absolutely certain that they were making the right choice, even though it was the harder one. At exactly 9 a.m., Maeve dialed Colonel Sanchez's number, her hand steady now, with the certainty of her decision. Julian and Sophia sat on either side of her, close enough to offer silent support, but giving her the space she needed to speak for herself. "Colonel Sanchez, this is Staff Sergeant Wood. I've made my decision. Yes, I accept reinstatement too. Active duty. Yes, I'll be at Fort Braxton this afternoon for processing. And Colonel, I want to testify about Grandview Manor, all of it. Everything that happened there and everyone who was responsible." When she hung up the phone, the kitchen was quiet for a moment, all 3 of them absorbing the magnitude of what had just been set in motion. Then Sophia jumped up from her chair and threw her arms around Maeve in a fierce hug that spoke of pride and love and the bittersweet joy of watching someone choose to be brave. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "I'm so proud to know you." Julian's arms came around both of them, creating a circle of warmth and strength that felt like home distilled down to its essential elements, not a place, but a feeling, not walls and a roof, but the absolute certainty that they belonged to each other regardless of geography or circumstance. "This isn't goodbye," Julian said firmly, his voice rough with emotion. "This is see you soon and call when you can, and we'll be here when you need us. This is family. Maeve, real family doesn't end just because someone gets deployed or reassigned or decides to save the world from a Pentagon office." As they broke apart and began the practical work of packing her few belongings and preparing for the drive to Fort Braxton, Maeve felt something settle in her chest that she had never experienced before. The absolute confidence that came from making the choice from strength rather than fear, from love rather than self-protection, from trust in the people who had proven themselves worthy of that trust. She was going back to the army, back to the career she had earned through blood and sacrifice, and 18 months of injustice finally corrected. But she wasn't going back as the same person who had fled Grandview Manor in the middle of the night. She was going back as someone who had learned what home really meant. Someone who had discovered that family wasn't something you were born into, but something you chose to build and maintain and fight for every single day. And as she folded Julian's mother's quilt and placed it carefully in her duffel bag alone, not a gift, because she would be back to return it, Maeve Wood finally understood that courage wasn't about choosing between love and duty. Courage was about being loved enough to know that you were worthy of both. 6 months later, the Pentagon's Logistics Command Center hummed with the kind of organized efficiency that only came from having someone in charge who understood that. Every decision, every delayed shipment, every miscommunicated order could mean the difference between soldiers coming home and families receiving folded flags. Staff Sergeant First Class Maeve Wood stood before a wall of monitors displaying supply chains that stretched across 3 continents, her fingers dancing across tablet screens as she coordinated the movement of medical supplies to a forward operating base in Eastern Europe, ammunition to training facilities in Georgia, and winter gear to troops stationed in Alaska. It was exactly the kind of work she had always dreamed of doing, complex, vital, intellectually challenging in ways that made her feel like she was using every skill she had developed over 9 years of military service. But the best part, the part that made her smile every morning when she badged into the building, was the knowledge that she was here because she had chosen courage over comfort, duty over safety, and truth over the easy lie of staying hidden. Bronze Star Medal sat in a frame on her desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the moment she had learned that sometimes the hardest battles were the ones you fought for justice, for accountability, for the principle that doing the right thing mattered more than protecting yourself from the consequences. The ceremony had been everything Colonel Sanchez had promised: media coverage, speeches about military justice and accountability, recognition that felt both overwhelming and long overdue. But the moment that had mattered most, the moment that had made all of it worthwhile, had come after the official ceremony, when she had spotted Julian and Sophia in the crowd, both of them dressed in their best clothes, both of them beaming with pride that was visible from across the room. Julian had taken leave from Patterson's heavy equipment to be there, and Sophia had convinced her school to let her miss 2 days of classes for what she called the most important history lesson of my life. "Look at you," Sophia had said when they found each other after the ceremony, her teenage face bright with tears of pride. "Look at our war hero, our war hero." The words had hit Maeve like a physical embrace, the absolute certainty that no matter how many miles separated them, no matter how different their daily lives had become, she still belonged to them and they still belonged to her. The transition to Pentagon life hadn't been easy. There had been weeks of medical evaluations, psychological assessments, and briefings on everything from classified protocols to the Pentagon's labyrinthine bureaucracy. There had been nights when she lay in her small apartment in Arlington, surrounded by boxes she hadn't quite unpacked, wondering if she had made the right choice, if the family she had left behind in Ironwood Springs was real enough to sustain a love that had to survive on phone calls and weekend visits. But Julian and Sophia had proven, again and again, that real love wasn't diminished by distance. Julian called every morning before she left for work, wanting to hear about her day before it started, wanting to share the small details of his own life, which trucks he was working on, how Sophia was doing in school, what he was cooking for dinner in the kitchen that still felt like her kitchen too. Sophia texted constantly, sharing everything from homework frustrations to boys she had crushes on to articles she found about military logistics that made her think of Maeve. And every other weekend, one of them made the drive. Sometimes Julian and Sophia came to Washington, staying in Maeve's apartment and playing tourist in a city that felt like the center of the world. Sometimes Maeve drove back to Ironwood Springs, where Julian's house waited for her like a sanctuary, where her coffee mug still sat in the kitchen cabinet, where Julian's mother's quilt was always clean and folded at the foot of the couch that would forever be her couch too. The Grandview Manor testimony had been harder than the medal ceremony, harder than learning Pentagon protocols, harder than anything except maybe the original trauma itself. Sitting in a courtroom, facing the people who had abused their power and authority to hurt vulnerable veterans, had required a different kind of courage than she had ever needed in combat. But she had done it, had spoken truth to power, had helped ensure that other veterans would never face what she had faced. Major Henderson had been court-martialed and dishonorably discharged. The administrators at Grandview Manor had been prosecuted for fraud and abuse. The entire program had been shut down and replaced with legitimate transitional services overseen by people who understood that helping veterans meant actually helping them, not exploiting their vulnerability for personal gain. "You did that," Julian had told her after the final hearing, his voice rough with emotion. "You made sure it couldn't happen to anyone else." "We did that," she had corrected, because none of it would have been possible without the strength she had found in his house, without the courage Sophia had helped her discover, without the love that had made her brave enough to fight for justice, even when fighting was the scarier choice. Now, 6 months into her Pentagon assignment, Maeve had found a rhythm that felt sustainable, fulfilling, and true to everything she had learned about herself during those transformative days on Birchwood Lane. Her work was challenging and meaningful, utilizing skills she had developed over years of military service while allowing her to impact thousands of soldiers' lives in ways she had never imagined possible. Her relationship with Julian and Sophia had not only survived the transition, but had grown stronger, deepened by the shared knowledge that they had chosen each other deliberately, courageously, with full understanding of what that choice would require. The biggest surprise had been how naturally Julian and Sophia had integrated into her new life. Julian had visited often enough that he knew the security guards at the Pentagon by name, and they had started joking that he was their unofficial morale officer, the civilian who brought homemade cookies and asked about their families. Sophia had become fascinated with Washington, D.C., with the intersection of history and politics and military strategy that surrounded Maeve's daily work. She was already talking about colleges in the area, about studying international relations or political science, about finding ways to serve something bigger than herself, just like the woman who had become her unofficial big sister. "I want to be like you," Sophia had said during her most recent visit, the two of them walking through Arlington National Cemetery on a crisp Saturday morning. "I want to do work that matters, that helps people, that makes a difference." "You already are like me," Maeve had replied, stopping to straighten the flowers they had placed on a random grave, a small gesture of respect for a soldier whose family couldn't visit. "You're brave, you're kind, you think about other people before yourself. That's all that matters, the rest is just details." Julian's integration into her new world had been more complicated, but equally meaningful. He couldn't relocate Sophia, was settled in school, his business was established, and Pentagon area cost of living was prohibitive for a small-town mechanic. But he had found ways to be part of Maeve's Washington life that didn't require geographic proximity. He had become her emotional anchor, the person she called when Pentagon politics got frustrating, when the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming, when she needed to remember why she was doing this work in the first place. And slowly, carefully, they had begun talking about the future in ways that felt possible rather than fantastical. Sophia would graduate from high school in 2 years, and she was already researching colleges in the Washington area. Julian had been exploring the possibility of franchising his mechanical expertise, maybe opening a second location near D.C., maybe finding ways to build a business that could exist in multiple places. They weren't rushing toward anything. weren't making decisions based on desperation or fear of loss, but they were planning like people who intended to build a life together, who understood that love was something you constructed deliberately. One choice at a time. The transformation was most visible during their weekend reunions, whether in Washington or Ironwood Springs. They moved around each other with the easy intimacy of people who had learned each other's rhythms, who knew how to make space for individual dreams while maintaining connection. Julian would work on his laptop at Maeve's kitchen table, managing his business remotely while she prepped for Monday briefings. Sophia would spread homework across the floor, asking for help with history papers while live tweeting her reactions to C-SPAN. They cooked together, watched movies together, argued about politics, and laughed about inside jokes, and created the kind of domestic happiness that proved family was something you chose every day, not something that required traditional structures or geographic proximity. You know what the best part is? Sophia had asked during their most recent weekend together, all three of them crammed onto Julian's couch, watching a documentary about military logistics that Maeve had recommended and that had somehow become appointment television for their makeshift family. "What's the best part?" Julian asked, his arm around Maeve's shoulders, her head resting against his chest in the kind of comfortable intimacy that felt like home distilled down to its essential elements. "The best part is that you two figured out how to love each other without anyone having to become smaller," Sophia said with the matter-of-fact wisdom of someone who had watched her parents' marriage fail because neither of them had been brave enough to support the other's dreams. Dad didn't have to stop being a mechanic who lives in a small town, and Maeve didn't have to stop being a soldier who saves the world from a Pentagon office. You just made room for both. As winter settled into spring and spring turned toward summer, Maeve found herself thinking often about that night 6 months ago when she had been walking alone on a dark highway, carrying nothing but trauma and a duffel bag, convinced that she had lost everything that mattered. She thought about the moment Julian had stopped, the choice he had made to help a stranger, the door he had opened that had led not just to shelter but to the kind of love that made people braver, stronger, more themselves than they had ever been alone. The story could have ended differently. She could have stayed on Birchwood Lane, could have chosen safety over service, comfort over courage, the illusion of permanence over the harder truth that real love meant supporting each other's growth, even when that growth was scary or inconvenient, or geographically complicated. But because Julian and Sophia had loved her enough to send her back to the fight she was born to win, because they had chosen to build a family strong enough to survive any distance, because they had taught her that home wasn't a place, but a feeling that traveled wherever love was brave enough to follow, Maeve Wood had become everything she was meant to be: a decorated soldier, a devoted daughter, a woman worthy of the family she had chosen and who had chosen her in return, standing in the Pentagon Command Center, coordinating operations that would keep soldiers safe and missions successful. Maeve understood that sometimes the most beautiful stories began not with happy endings but with the courage to trust that love was big enough to hold every dream, strong enough to survive every challenge, and generous enough to make room for everyone to become exactly who they were supposed to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.